Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Parmenius podcast. We're excited to have with us today another guest, Michelle Rebidoux. A native of Southern Ontario, Michelle Rebidoux studied art, philosophy, and religious studies at various Canadian universities, receiving her Ph.D. in religion and culture from McGill University in 2008. She currently resides in St. John's, Newfoundland, where she teaches religious studies at Memorial University and theology at Queen's College. In her spare time, Michelle loves painting large-scale canvases and murals on religious themes, writing poetry, and hiking in the beautiful Newfoundland landscape. Her first book of poetry, The Last Thing is Longing, Wipf Stock, was published in 2001. Michelle, thanks for being on the podcast with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Great. So we wanted you on in particular to talk to you a bit about art and the sacred, but before getting into that, maybe we can ask you a bit more broadly about your work, your philosophical trajectory and history.
Sure. My own philosophical background is in the tradition of phenomenology. And that's what I did my doctorate on at McGill. And in particular, sort of the late 20th century French, what they call the theological turn of French phenomenology in the late 20th century. And the main figures of this would be people like Ricoeur, Michel Henry, Jean-Luc Marion, Levinas, of course, and a variety of others. And the other area that I'm interested in is the 20th century movement of religious personalism. Emmanuel Mounier, Jacques Martier would be people from a Catholic perspective, but sort of at the base of that is, of course, Martin Buber. And Martin Buber's classic I and Thou, or Ich und Du, people say there's one book that's going to change your life and is going to stick with you with everything you do. And Martin Buber's I and Thou was really that book for me. And what I do is I bring together Martin Buber's personalism with the late 20th century theological turn of phenomenology, and I can connect that to art as well. And so let me just sort of give a background of how I understand phenomenology in this context. The phenomenology is basically the study of phenomenality, and that comes from the Greek word phanastai, which means to appear. So literally, phenomenology is the study of the power to appear, of what appears. But phenomenology or phenomenality always requires two things: the thing that appears, the appearing of the thing that appears, and also the subject or the consciousness to which it appears. And so phenomenology is a study of both of these things, a study of the consciousness to which the thing appears and the nature of the appearing of that which appears. Now, early phenomenology of these two sides, early phenomenology tended to put more of the emphasis on the side of the subject or on the side of consciousness, studying the structures of perception, the structures of consciousness, even the structures of reason, which made it possible for the thing to appear. So the focus was very much set up a subject-object relationship between the object that appeared and the subject to which it appeared. And the subject's structures of perception largely, though not wholly, determined how the thing appeared. What you get then in late 20th century phenomena, you actually start to get this already in Heidegger, but it becomes more explicit in late 20th century phenomenology, probably the most explicit of all in the work of Jean-Luc Marion. The question then becomes, well, is it possible for the force of a thing's givenness, right? When the thing appears, it gives itself in a kind of self-givenness. Is it possible for the thing's self-givenness to overwhelm the structures of perception or the structures of consciousness, and yet to appear anyway? So Marion refers to this as saturated phenomenality. When the structures of perception are so completely overwhelmed, what ends up happening is that the self-givenness of the thing that is showing itself actually ends up in some way reconstituting the structures of perception within the subject. So the subject becomes a new subject. And, Buber, go back to Buber's I and Now. This is already here in some sense in Buber's work, because Buber's work, sets up the I-it relation with the I-thou relation. The I-it relation is basically a subject-object relation where the subject controls how the object appears. The I-thou relation is more like a subject-subject relation, and the I is not in control of what's happening there. It's a more open, a more vulnerable relationship, and the I ends up getting changed through its encounter with the thou. It can't make the thou into a controlled, mastered object. And so it's the same with saturated phenomenality. The force of the self-givenness of that which is appearing overflows and overwhelms the subject so that it ends up reconstituting the subject. And, another thing that you can connect this to is within the Christian mystical tradition, the tradition of the spiritual senses, how, as spiritual development takes place, in the writings of the mystics, you get the idea that a new set of eyes or a spiritual set of ears or, a different kind of touching comes into being. And in that case, that enables the seer or the hearer or the feeler to encounter something, to sense something that you wouldn't be able to sense with just your physical senses, because that person has been reconstituted with spiritual senses. So you can connect all of these ideas together and then relate that to the question of the sacred and the question of the divine. Marion talks about the possibility of the appearance of the divine by saying that it is like a saturated phenomenon that overflows your senses, but then reconstitutes you in order to be able to appear to you nevertheless in a different way. And in terms of art, originally, you could talk about art being in churches, being used to tell narratives of the events of Jesus's life or the lives of the saints for people who couldn't read. But it's also an attempt to make visible to everyday perception that which might be visible or audible or sensed by spiritual senses. So basically using the spiritual senses to bring into being the sensing of spiritual sense, basically making art to bring into being, to allow the sensings of the spiritual senses to shine through the sensings of the physical senses. And to a certain extent, this is what artists of sacred art try to do. They try to bring the invisible into visible form. Just to get back to Buber again, he talks about the I-thou relationship in various, there are various spheres in which you can have this I-thou relationship. And one of the spheres he talks about is the sphere of relation with what he calls spiritual beings. So what in the world what does he mean by spiritual beings? Well, he actually means it's quite a broad title for him. It could cover, for example, great scientific discoveries or political visions or even artistic works. Of course, it definitely refers to artistic works. It can even refer to something like an angel, who knows? But the idea is that in terms of artistic works, you have an encounter with a spiritual being, and that spiritual being or that spiritual reality wants to come into physical manifestation through you. And so the artist feels as if accosted by it and has to bring that thing into physical being. Now, in some sense, there's a loss there because you're never going to capture the fullness of it by doing that. But at the same time, it has to be brought into being in some way, right? So you wrestle with it and you work at it. So that's basically my own philosophical perspective. Was that good?
So yeah, absolutely. Yeah, just something you wanted to add?
Oh, I suppose the way I would think of it, and I don't know, maybe this is too Gadamer-like or something, but in the process of hermeneutic communication, of course, the condition of the subject or the assumptions or biases of the subject determine in a certain way the reception of the text. But if the text is received in a full way, then of course there's a transformation of the receiver as well.
Yes.
Yeah. So in other words, if I'm reading Gadamer, there's things I'm going to not get because I'm not Gadamer, right? But at the same time, as I am assimilating what he writes, I am being assimilated to him, so that there's a kind of fusion or melting of consciousnesses, if you want to put it that way. And I think that perhaps what you're saying is that aesthetic experience is one of the most intense forms of this.
Actually, you raise an interesting point, and it's something that I didn't mention at all, and that's the question of how the audience receives the work that's brought into being. Yeah. Because all I talked about was how the artist was struggling with that which wants to come into being through the artist. But then, of course, that work is out there and it gets encountered. And ideally, what would be desired would be that whatever the artist brought into being, the artist was able somehow to, let's say, capture it in a living way in the physical form that they brought forth. And if that was the case, then that would touch something in the audience too. Now, obviously, there's going to be biases, both, sort of pre structures in the mind or whatever in the culture, in the tradition of what the artist is going to do when they bring that thing into being, but also of how the audience will encounter it. And sure, there's, maybe you might say something gets lost in translation, but at the same time, from translation from consciousness to consciousness, as it were, but at the same time, if the living reality, and when I say living reality, I really mean it here, right? Because for Buber, this is an actual encounter with an actual spiritual reality. It's not just an imagination of the artist, right? So if the living reality is still in it, then it might get interpreted differently, but there's still going to be something living there.
So the way I would put it, Michelle, I suppose, is that if there is always something lost in translation, there's always something gained in translation.
Sure, you could put it that way.
Yeah, I mean.
So this idea.
So go ahead, Jordan.
No, absolutely. Yeah. That's very interesting, guys. So the Jean-Luc Marion thing with the saturated phenomenality, it seems like there would be this ever extending chain of saturated phenomenality, even the artist extending it outward and then someone explaining to their friend what it is. Mm-hmm. And then, the kind of reception of it itself being this thing. So that's really interesting. So this brings us back to art. And if you guys would like, we could go into the next question, which we hope to ask you, Michelle, which was, so in a broadly secular society, culture, whatever, what have you, where is the sacred given allowance to live outside of traditional spaces of the sacred, of sacredness, this kind of thing?
Okay, well, I have, I think there's really, I can think of 4 different places. They're not all related to art, but 4 different places where you can really point to the sacred, somehow the livingness of the sacred really being there. And I mean, not that 4 is an exhaustive list. I'm sure there could be many more, but the ones that come to my mind are most prevalently in nature or in the environment. And I think that, part of the reason for this is because, due to the environmental crisis, so much focus is placed on the environment, and so much emphasis is on, somehow getting back to the environment, understanding the human as more connected with the environment. And people just want to, have some kind of deep relationship with the environment, a sort of intercommunion with the environment. I mean, there's also the fact that there's a kind of rise in sensitivity to the ever more widely publicized issues of indigenous peoples as well. So all of these factors really play together, and people are really starting to look to the environment, look to nature, to have a kind of spiritual experience or experience of the sacred. They're looking for some kind of peace, a different kind of value, some kind of like, an understanding of what it really means to be interdependent with nature as opposed to masters over nature, which you get in kind of corporate, capitalist life. They're looking for, maybe a kind of intimacy of an I-thou experience with nature, spirits in nature, whatever, right? So that's the first place. Second place, this is for me deeply influenced by Levinas and the way in which Emmanuel Levinas has influenced ethics in the late 20th century and into the 21st century. Ethics on the ground, like on the ground human rights work, the face of the other, the level of atrocities and tragedies that are happening now all over the world, some of them being environment related, some of them being war, some of them being, authoritarian governments, whatever it is. And the human rights work. The very idea of human rights, is based in the idea that we all have inherent dignity, in sort of current international, United Nations talk, right? Human rights is based in the idea that we have inherent dignity. But how is inherent dignity defined? Well, it's kind of undefined. Now, when human rights was first articulated back in the 1600s, it was often associated with the idea that, well, we're somehow created in the image of God, from the context of Christian writers, we're somehow created in the image of God, and therefore that's what gives us our inherent dignity. But, the religious roots of human rights discourse has really been removed from the discourse precisely in order to make it more universal. It's sort of from the World War II on, right, to make it more international, more global. So inherent dignity kind of functions today as a kind of peremptory concept. Everybody has inherent dignity, period. We don't have to define it. We simply have it. But in the face of these absolute tragedies and atrocities, I think it's experienceable. If you are doing human rights work on the ground and you're seeing and experiencing and helping people in these, in the context of trying to overcome these atrocities, you see, like, and this would be Levinas, influencing it as well. You see in the face of the other what inherent dignity really means, and it doesn't need a definition because you feel it, right?
Michelle, if I may interject with a kind of Levinas question, I seem to recall, my memory of this is a little hazy, but in one of his essays, Levinas, and I think he's thinking of the suffering Christ here. Does he speak of the beauty of the other?
Not really. And actually, that's an interesting point because the beauty is the next point that I have. But the beauty, one of the things that Levinas, and he, you know what, I'm not sure.
I'm not sure either. No, it's just that you would think that something like beauty would be one of those totalizing characters, one of those totalizing concepts for Levinas. And yet there's a passage, I should have looked it up before I came here, and I think he's very much thinking of, say, like a painting of the crucifixion, where one is saturated by the vulnerability and fragility of the other.
Yes, and perhaps he uses the word beauty here and there, but my gut feeling about Levinas, and I've not read everything he's written, but I have read a lot.
You've read more than me.
My gut feeling is that he's suspicious of the concept of beauty, partly because it often gets associated with eros.
Sure.
And what he wants to do is avoid any idea of eros getting mixed up with ethics. Sure. Your relationship to the face of the other is he says, one of, the unlovable. It's more like agape than eros, right?
Yeah.
And beauty is one of those things that it comes close to eros all the time.
Yeah, it's a little too Platonist.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, if we had him sitting here and I pointed to him, to Grunwald's famous crucifixion, the painting I'm referring to?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, the Eisenheim altarpiece,
Yes.
where there's a profound spiritual beauty that transforms and elevates and illuminates that painting, yet the subject itself is the grossest ugliness. And Grunwald spares us no detail of even the putrefaction of Christ's body, right?
Yes.
And I actually wondered when I stumbled on that passage years ago whether he was thinking of that painting. Because it's, as you say, it's the most unlovable thing imaginable, right? It is that from which our being, most, decisively and absolutely recoils. Yet, of course, the painting has this, almost, I would have to say, rapturous quality to it.
Yes. Yeah, well, it's wonderful that you bring this up, precisely because beauty was my third point of where people can experience the sacred.
Yeah.
And, I don't know if I'm going to play the Platonist card here or not,
Go ahead. I mean, you're among friends if you do.
I mean, even if you don't talk about God at all, or the divine or the sacred, there's something about beauty that just awakens something, dare I say, in the soul, right? And
yeah.
I think maybe Levinas might say something like this. A painting of the unlovable might be beautiful, but when you're standing in the face of the unlovable, you don't have time to think of beauty because you have to help that person.
Sure.
Sure.
And in other words, and I suppose what that indicates is that a painting of the crucifixion is in some sense an aesthetically mediated experience. No one wants to be at the crucifixion.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Right. And I mean, look, what I personally think about that is that in a certain sense, what the artist gives us is the transfiguration that's not evident at the crucifixion itself, but like the artist in a certain sense is speaking from the standpoint of the resurrection. But that's...
Yeah.
I suppose a theological point of mine. I don't know.
By the way, I don't know if you know, but that was absolutely the favorite painting of Karl Barth.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And apparently he always kept a little small copy of it on his desk.
Really?
When he was writing the church dogmatics.
The church dogmatics, yeah. But at any rate, so Jordan, get us on to the...
Oh, we had another of the livingness of the secular, the sacred in society. There was a fourth. I think
there was a fourth, yes. So the fourth, I'm going to call it the idea of a kind of transcendence experience. People, even if you don't have any, religious belief, people they look for some kind of experience, whether, in whatever way, right? And transcendence experience is something that it might connect them with something more intimate. Even an I-thou relation can be a kind of transcendent experience because it somehow brings you out of your enclosed self and opens you to something else. Or it might, bring you out of your ego altogether and connect you with something larger, right? And, if you look at the studies that have been done in the field of religion and pop culture, there's all kinds of examples of what, transcendence experience that have sort of quasi-religious qualities, people going to sporting events, people going to rock concerts, even nationalism can be a kind of, quasi-religion, which gives people a transcendence experience. And I mean, I'm not going to say that some of this might not be dubious, but at the same time, what it points to is a deep desire, a deep longing in secular, especially heavily individualist culture, for people to somehow encounter something larger than themselves, in whatever way. And if the content might need discernment, but the structure of that transcendent experience is phenomenologically interesting.
Absolutely. It seems like not only as an explicit theme, but as a kind of tone. Like I like to watch like kind of religious films, and so people at least like to peer into the lives of, for example, I just watched yesterday, I don't know if you guys have seen the film about the Grand Chartreuse. So Philip Groening made a film about these Carthusian monks,
okay, yeah,
right?
Yeah.
And so it's like a 2.5 hour film of just basically silence and then the chants of the monks, and people just thought, wow, you know, it was very popular, I think, among like internet fad groups and whatnot. In 2005, he kind of released it or whatever. It took 2 or 3 years to film. But so just peering in on the kind of religious life of these, you know, fairly, I wouldn't say extreme, fairly strict religious
Carthusians, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, they took them
Carthusians, yeah. That film is called Into Great Silence.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
yes.
yeah. And it was a very like kind of droning experience in a way, because I'm like a music, well, I'm sure we're all music people, but I really like to think of sound in this way of like, and so this film really unified those to me. But outside of just that, to watch a film is always this united effort of a crowd, almost like sitting in, like, I don't know if you guys go to Catholic church, but like sitting in a Catholic mass and looking at the operations go on. But so this brings us to almost directly to this idea of secular tourism and sacredness being commodified. So I watch a film, I have this experience with these monks, I say, wow, I tell you about it, but it's a film.
And I will put the problem this way. Okay. When we speak about, and I don't know, maybe I'm showing my Platonist cards here or something, right? When we speak about beauty, and especially about aesthetic beauty, okay, we are generally thinking about art objects, okay? And art objects, of course, are notoriously commodifiable, right? Just go to Sotheby's and see what those Van Goghs are going for, right? Now, in antiquity and in, medieval Christendom, of course, sensible beauty exists in a certain tension with intelligible beauty. And of course, one of the manifestations of intelligible beauty or spiritual beauty is the force and power and beauty of a life, okay? So, a Benedictine monastery is an icon of God because it is a beautiful form of life, or it is a form of life or way of being in community that manifests the beautiful, right? Manifests the beautiful of God, okay? And so, in a sense, there's a kind of pervasiveness to the aesthetic, whereas nowadays the aesthetic is the sense of the aesthetic is confined to art objects. And then, like Benjamin would say, like, we've removed the aura from these objects, right? They don't exist in their original context or in their original form or their original purpose. So that, for instance, I can go to a concert and be, enraptured by, Beethoven's Missa Solemnis or something, right? And then I step out of that space, I step out of that experience, and I step over a homeless person on my way out, right? Okay, because maybe I see the beauty of Missa Solemnis, but I don't see the beauty of Christ in that homeless person, right? So I don't know, Michelle, what do you think of that?
So you're thinking in terms of the commodification of the symphony that you've just heard, the piece of music that you've just heard,
yeah,
which only sort of works in that particular setting.
Yeah.
Because it's presented and you've purchased tickets for it and you're sitting there and everything else is shut out, and then you go out into the world and you're no longer in that space. So that's part of the commodification, right?
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, that's definitely a problem. I think actually one of the things that I want to connect to that is the idea that in a certain sense, people forget in a heavily sort of capitalist, consumerist, individualist culture, people forget that spirituality is actually a discipline.
Yeah.
and not just sort of, a transcendence experience. I talked about transcendence experiences, but transcendence experiences aren't the path. They're little lights on the path, maybe, but the path is a hard road. And you might go and see this wonderful movie about the monks and the beautiful Benedictine setting, and it's an icon of the divine and the divine community, or experience the music. But then the idea is that is supposed to inspire you to walk the path. And what you don't see in the background is, and in fact, that's one of the things that really struck me about that movie, Into Great Silence, is that it's because it's mostly silence, and the Carthusians are, spend most of the day in prayer, and it doesn't show you, it doesn't actually, for me anyway, it didn't romanticize their life. It showed how hard it was. It showed how, there was one point where I remember the monk was kneeling down and he was praying, and the camera was on him for like 10 minutes, and he was just praying, and he got up and he just wasn't finished, so he knelt back down and started breathing again. Like it's rugged, tough work. Spirituality is rugged, tough work, and it beats the soul up. It beats the ego up. And those transcendence experiences are few and far between. It's mostly dry desert, and that's a good thing, because that's also part of the way in which the ego gets disciplined. But an individualist consumerist culture doesn't want that discipline. It just wants the transcendence fixes, right? The 30 Days to Enlightenment kind of books. And if this path isn't working for me, then I'm going to go try that path, or I'm going to take a little bit from every path, the kind of postmodern bricolage, version. So it's the idea is that we want to open to, and we want to open to depth and height and infinity. We want to be opened by an I-thou relation, or by a spiritual reality, but we really want to do it in our own terms. We want to remain in control. In other words, we want the saturated phenomena, but we deny what the saturated phenomena does to us.
And in that case, you are not receiving the phenomenon at all in its full, saturation, if you like, right? If your transformation is only a kind of temporary exaltation that you get at the end of a performance, say, right, then the work is not sunk into you at all, really.
No, it might change you a bit, but I guess, that's the thing. You can be changed a bit by bit, maybe over time, but the idea is that you've also got to be aware of that this is a path, not just it's not like a drug fix.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
Right. It's hard work.
And by the way, the artist knows that, right?
Yes. And for that matter, look at sports.
The athlete knows that.
The athlete knows that. The artist, anybody who's actually, working in those fields knows how hard it is, right? And the discipline that's required.
Yeah, everyone has a sense that, like they're a creative genius until you try to pursue an artistic path for a long time. And so, insight, or even inspiration, is not the path.
No,
it's like a spectral part of the path. I think that's such a great point. And I was maybe I made it seem more romantic than it was, that film, because I was taken by all the sensory domains, but I wasn't sweeping and delivering the food to the fathers, and that's a great point, Michelle, honestly.
I remember actually when I was watching it that there were parts where I was dreadfully bored, but in some sense that's the whole point, because that's what this you have the very fact that you're bored shows that you're addicted to the excitement. You're addicted to the trends. People don't, enter a monastery because they want to have like raptures all the time. The raptures are few and far between.
Fair.
Now, what it reminds me of is I once saw a film, and one of the images in the film was of a Buddhist monk in Japan, a Zen monk, walking as slowly as possible. And, it's like every 5 minutes, like his foot would move slightly. And what I thought first was like, what a difficult discipline that must be. Because you want to get where you're going, right?
Yeah. But that's the point. The point is where you're going. The goal is enlightenment, so it's not a place.
So you're not going anywhere, I suppose.
You're not really going anywhere.
So what are you hurrying for?
Exactly.
Yeah.
When I teach at Memorial, what I do is I teach one of the classes I teach is Introduction to the World's Religions.
Yeah.
And when I get to Buddhism, I always do a little mindfulness meditation with them. Just, mindful of the breathing, mindful of what sounds they hear, moving parts of the body, etc. Right? And, naturally the mind will start to wander on other things. And then I say, no, bring it back and just look. And, I often have students say, and even if they don't say it, I say it, it's dreadfully boring. But that's just the point. It's boring because you're craving excitement, and craving is the whole root of ignorance.
Sure. Yeah. I think anybody, I think, who has tried to practice things like, contemplative prayer and signally failed at them knows that silencing the mind, and especially like if you're somebody like me who talks for a living, right? What I'm doing here, right? I'm in a profession where I'm very heavily invested in the discursive, right? And I don't have that capacity to still my mind, really. And I've tried.
It's funny.
Yeah, but anyway.
And so
No.
Sorry, Michelle, what was that?
No, I just said it's not easy.
It's not easy. Yeah.
No, and so like it's almost like a TikTok level, that kind of children's app of attention that we're kind of fighting here when we just have boredom as a goal, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Like a spiritual kind of goal.
Mm-hmm.
So that brings us back to this idea of secular tourism. And so you can go and experience, I mean, maybe it doesn't directly bring it back, but you can experience the religious in little bite-sized pieces, or the sacred in bite-sized pieces, almost like a sugar fix. And so what are we to do about that, really?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, I once saw an interview with Vine Deloria, who is he was one of the indigenous elders in the United States, and he, was a teacher and gave all kinds of interviews. And in it, he talked about how Westerners were really interested in coming to the smudging ceremonies and this and that, and learning about indigenous culture. And he said they really only just barely scratched the surface. I mean, almost nothing at all. But yet they were having these, I had such a wonderful experience. And they would come up to him afterwards and thank him so much for the spiritual experience they had. And he said, I mean, they really have almost nothing, but it is better than nothing. It's better than nothing at all. So that to start with. But then eventually they're going to have to, if they want to be serious about actually following a real spiritual path, they've got to find one. And they've got to sort of keep their foot in that boat, and both feet in that boat, because if they try to, this is not working for me right now, I'm going to go to some other place, or I'm going to go to some other path, you can't do that, because then you never get anywhere, right? And what they're trying to do by doing that is usually trying to avoid the discipline that's required, because the problem is they want the experiences without the dry periods. Mm-hmm. Because discipline, the dry periods is where the discipline comes in, and discipline in the midst of a dry period will kind of feel like it's a negation of the self, but they want to always just feel their self affirmed, right? So I guess to start with, having little transcendence experiences like that is better than nothing. But on the other hand, eventually there has to be a recognition and an embrace of a single path and a discipline, a hard discipline, and that's hard work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I'll tell you about that something that I think about, Michelle, which is that I really envy people of the Islamic faith who have to pray 5 times a day, right?
Mhm.
Because of course, if it's up to me, I won't pray any times a day.
Yeah.
And like, I just, sometimes I think that's a wonderful discipline. And
It is.
yeah.
Absolutely.
There's something about having to pray versus choosing when is the best time to pray.
Yeah, which is never. Right?
Which is never. Or even if you, let's say I like to pray in the morning, like you pick a nice romantic time to pray. And then that too, it's like almost a questionable thing to choose. I don't know. I just agree with you. So it's like an enviable thing to have that kind of structure, right?
Mm-hmm. I'll tell you, I recently reviewed a book for a publisher about Leonard Cohen. And apparently, do you happen to remember the name of the monastery, either of you, he was at? It's apparently one of the strictest of the Zen monasteries in North America. And like, you can't even get up for the bathroom if you're meditating, right? I'm just very impressed, and I'm almost kind of envious of the people who have that kind of resolution, that kind of capacity of, stick-to-itedness, right?
Mm.
And I think, if you're Leonard Cohen, maybe the discipline of being an artist helps with that in a way. Like, not that being the artist is enough, right? But, if anything, it will teach you patience, it's learning an art form. Right?
Yes.
Or I guess, Jordan, in your case, learning martial art.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah,
very painful.
Yeah. I've heard people who talk about martial arts who, say, like, with the typical Western student, the only thing I can't teach them is patience.
Just give me all of the moves.
I want all of the moves, right?
All of the techniques.
Yeah.
Well, this comes to a fore, especially in painting very large murals, which I'm looking at a photo of your painting here, Michelle.
Yeah.
And so
yes, let's get it around to Michelle's paintings here.
Absolutely. So maybe you could tell us broadly how you got to painting. Let me see, St. Mark's Anglican Church. Was it 4 murals you painted in there?
I did. Yeah. Well, okay. So I've always written poetry for a very long time. So the book that I recently published, so it was published in 2021. That was actually a collection of poems that I've written over 20 years. But I only started painting since I came to St. John's, and that was in 2008. And right from the start, I had this craving to paint large, and I always do sort of themes from the world's religions. So I don't always do Christian themes. I've done paintings from Hinduism, paintings from Judaism, paintings from Christianity. I have one planned already for Buddhism, but I always like to paint large. And the largest canvas that you can get at Michael's, anyway, is 4 foot by 5 foot. And I painted
That's capitalism for you.
Yeah, I painted several canvases that size, and I just felt this is not big enough. I was craving something bigger, but if I really went any bigger, I mean, I would have to. I was starting to feel like I wanted to do a mural somewhere, but obviously I would have to go out and do that in a public space, right? Yeah. Now, I started teaching at Queen's College in 2015, which is the theological college here in St. John's. And every year they have their what's called the Queen's College Appeal, which is where faculty from the college go to various churches and they, tell about what's going on at Queen's College, what we do, what our theology degrees consist of, who can go there, how the students need help. In other words, would you like to please make a donation of whatever you can to our programs there. So I went to St. Mark's for the Queen's College Appeals. This is the Anglican Church on Logie Bay Road in St. John's. And I knew the rector, Rob Cook, because at that time he also teaches, he's now full-time at Queen's College, but at that time he was the rector at St. Mark's as well. And I went into their church, and it was the first time I was there, and I looked behind the altar, behind the sanctuary. They had these 6 bare panels, which apparently at one point they had drapery hanging in, but the drapery was so old that they took it down to clean it, and it literally disintegrated. So then they were trying to decide what they would put in those panels in place, and I just saw them, and it, talk about a spiritual reality wanting to come into manifestation through you. I felt like a ton of bricks fell upon my head and said to me, "You've got to paint those." So I went up to Rob after the service and I said, "You've really got to let me paint those." So he said, well, he was really open to it. And he said, make a proposal. So I went home. I very quickly I only painted 4 of them. And I painted them with the symbols of the 4 evangelists. And I went home that night and I got the measurements, and I literally within 2 hours I had the entire thing envisioned and sketched out. It just came, if there's any experience, Buberian experience of a spiritual being wanted to become manifest through that was it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I brought it to Rob, and he passed it by the vestry committee, and they all loved it. So I did it. That took me a year and a half to do. Recently, in fact, just 2 days ago, I finished a large mural in the common room of Queen's College. And then just this past weekend, I was also talking to one of the head ministers from the local United Church here, with the possibility of maybe painting something in that church too. So I'm really excited to do these kinds of great big giant works.
How have they been received? Is there anything particularly interesting about how people are receiving them? Have there been responses that surprise you in any way?
One woman told me once that, and this moved me like anything, and I felt very honored. She said that because, speaking of beauty, she said because they are beautiful, and I used very bright colors, and I made them match the stained glass windows. Yeah. She said because they're so vibrant and beautiful, they help her pray, which really honored me. I felt very honored by that.
Because that's what you're supposed to be doing, right? If you're that kind of, like a medieval craftsman or something, it's in a certain sense an aid to contemplation, an aid to intellectual or spiritual ascent, or an aid to prayer. And so when you get a comment like that, you've nailed it.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I know because I'm a poet of a sort myself, and I often wonder about whether there is going to be a wild difference between what I am sending out and what people are receiving, and whether I should be worried about that or not. I don't know, but
I didn't know you were a poet. I'd love to read some of your poetry.
Well, it's published here and there, but in fact, I'm even a little paranoid sometimes when I'm writing that, people are going to take this in the exact wrong way. But
I tend not to. I do think of, actually, that's not even true. I don't. I was going to say I do think of the audience if I'm painting a mural in a public space.
Yeah.
I guess I do at first when I try to plan, how it should look in the space. Like, for example, the murals at the church, I really tried to match with the windows.
Yeah.
So to a certain extent, I do think of that in advance. But once I'm involved in the painting, I just paint whatever the inspiration comes as.
Yeah.
I forget, the audience sort of fades away. And it's the same with poetry. I mean, I've never really cared what other people thought about it.
Yeah, and of course, ideally, you're just there as kind of a reed instrument or something, to use a Sufi image or something. The thing flows through you, right? and then like I find that, you know, if you're able to purge that kind of secondary reflective step where, okay, how do I have to shape this to the expectations of the people who are going to be looking at it, right? Like, I think that's good.
I mean, another thing is, I don't do this for the money, right? I mean, I've got my day job teaching at the university, so.
Sure.
I guess, and this goes back to the problem of commodification, right?
Yeah, sure.
If you're an artist for a living, and you're trying to please the art purchasing audience or the gallery that knows what sells, then maybe that's going to be more of a question for you. I mean, in some sense, I'm lucky that I do experience maybe quite a bit of freedom in my creativity because I don't have to depend on it for money.
Sure.
But I know that is a, you know, if you make your living as an artist and you've got to please the gallery owner, and, you know, that is, and if you haven't yet, you know, really sort of established yourself as, okay, this is my style, and now that is what sells, right? But even then, if you change your style, people might more, you know, cool off, you know?
Yeah. So go ahead, Jordan.
But I did have a few kind of other questions, if it's okay with you, Michelle.
Sure.
One of them was related to this whole language of livingness, which I really like within the secular society. To me, kind of draws to mind the nature of, well, like nature itself. So the kind of theopoetics of nature. I just have been reading Catherine Keller's book on planetary entanglement. I'm not sure if you partake in any of these kind of spheres, but the Yale Forum of Religion and Ecology, you know, like with the second encyclical of Pope Francis, with the subtitle On Care for Our Common Home, like this whole integration of religion and ecology, as religion being the best framework to think in the broadest terms of our ecological problems. Do you ever partake in any of these spheres, and do you think nature has something to tell us about religion today and religion about nature today?
Well, I mean, I do. Sometimes if a variety of conferences, I've sat in on various of the panels or presented on ecological and religious themes. And I also, at Memorial, I teach a course in religion and the environment. And at Queen's College, I teach a course specifically in Christianity and the environment. So I know the field. And I mean, in some sense, I definitely agree that religion is one of the ways to get into discussions about the environment, which can be very fruitful, because, you know, all of the religious traditions have some sense of the sacredness of the world for what in whatever way. I mean, obviously, they're all going to articulate it very differently. The main problem, I don't want to say problem, I'm going to say challenge. The main challenge that I see consistently in taking that approach is you're still going to end up with the issue of religious pluralism, because there are all of the various religions out there. And if you go to, for example, an interfaith conference, you know, and the environment today is always one of the themes that gets discussed, and all the different people from the different religious backgrounds can agree that the environment is the problem, and they'll bring to the table what their own religion says about what the proper relationship with the environment is, and all of that's wonderful. But then how do you translate that worldwide into policy, right? There's not just one religion, and I don't know. I'm not suggesting that there should be, but I think this is one of the reasons why I really like, one of the reasons I think that I originally went into phenomenology. It has a vocabulary which is very fecund for talking about spiritual experience from whatever religion. So the kind of phenomenological vocabulary that has grown out of this so-called theological turn is capable of dealing with spiritual experiences while to a certain extent not being 100% committed to a specific institutional religious vocabulary. And I think people can, just to give you an example, there's Masao Abe is a wonderful writer who he does absolutely brilliant phenomenological work describing the Christian experience of kenosis, or the self-emptying of Christ, and the Buddhist experience of shunyata, which is emptiness. But he does it all in kind of phenomenological language. So phenomenology is very rich in its vocabulary and has possibilities for bringing people from different religious backgrounds together. And if only a vocabulary can be created which somehow is inclusive of all religions without being reductively syncretic, that's the challenge. And I don't think we're anywhere near really meeting that challenge yet. But I do see it as at least a possibility.
Yeah. If there's a phenomenology of the sacred, it should apply to all the various manifestations of the sacred. I mean, that, I suppose, would be a kind of constitutional demand that any phenomenology of spirituality would make.
Yes. But at the same time, the post-structuralist critique of phenomenology is that it's too generalizing or reductive. So and this is why I think Mariel's work on the saturated phenomenon is so interesting, because it doesn't hold up those, human structures as the final word.
Yeah. So there isn't a phenomenology of the sacred in the sense that we could reduce all manifestations of the sacred to the same kind of science, say.
Right.
Yeah. But nonetheless, if you're in the context of religious studies, say, right? Well, one wants to, or it's presumed, I don't know if people use the phrase comparative religion anymore, but it's assumed that there is some kind of activity of comparison of A to B, okay? And so in your world religions course, you teach Buddhism, you teach Hinduism, and the assumption is that you're going to draw interesting comparisons or analogies and relations or differences between these things, okay? Earlier in the day, right, way back in the 20th century, there were certain people like, I believe, Otto and Mircea Eliade and so on, who said, well, the correct approach to religion is a phenomenological one, right? But they're always subject to that same accusation or that same problem that you've raised, which is, isn't that reductive of the particularity and uniqueness and, well, frankly, givenness? Because, everything is given or everything is shown forth in the mode of its particularity, right? Even if there are generalizations to be made. So like as an artist or as a scholar or, just as a human being, how do you work around that kind of problem?
I don't work around it. I've been working through it, and
Sure.
Like I said, I feel I don't know any other path. In terms of my own philosophical thinking, I am committed to phenomenology.
Yeah.
I am, and that is probably the most lingering question for me. How can I don't want to say solve the problem but how can I face the challenge of religious pluralism?
Yeah.
How can I create a vocabulary? Bernie, I just want to, I'll say right now that the book that I recently published of poetry, Bernie very kindly wrote a little thing on the back cover for me, introducing the book. One of the things you said there, which I really, was very happy that you said it, that they're poems they're poems of devotion in an ecumenical mode. That readers of divergent traditions will find, accessible. That I name no particular lord of any religion, but I'm sort of speaking to an encounter I'm speaking within the context of an encounter in those poems. And because I teach religious studies, and because I understand and I know stories from all the different traditions, some of those poems are influenced by, of course, Christianity, some by Judaism, some by Islam, some by Buddhism, you know. But to me, that's all in my encounter, it's all the same thou. It's all the same I-thou relationship that I'm having. Yeah. Now, I'm not going to say that that's not going to be critiqued by some people.
Sure.
You know, a strong Christian or a strong Muslim or a strong Buddhist might critique my work and say, oh, she's not, you know, she might be drawing from some idea in Buddhism, but that's not Buddhism. Sure, that's true. Absolutely true. And I'm not, you know, it's, and I don't know, what can my struggle?
And okay, and like I might put the problem this way. You know, pluralism and ecumenism are fine from the standpoint of somebody like you and me. But if, you know, like certain indigenous peoples, you are, you know, on a path or in a tradition, there's a threatened tradition, right? The impulse there is very naturally going to be to erect kind of boundaries to stop the thing from dissipating, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And I suppose there are even in, you know, I'm not one of them, but, you know, there are people in the Catholic or the Christian or the Anglican or, you know, even the evangelical Protestant world who are going to say, well, you know, the more we are open to ecumenism and pluralism, the more we are open to the other, the more we are attenuating what is our own, right? So there's a kind of conflict between, you know, maintaining what is our own, right, and opening what is our own to the other, which is like, you know, that's the conflict of hermeneutics and reading. That's kind of the conflict of anything, right?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I'll not deny that. I mean, I know the whole thing is totally fraught with difficulties.
Yeah.
But I don't know any other way forward. I mean, I said before that you've got to pick a path and stay on that path. Yeah. And, you know, I am on a path. And I do stick to that path, but that doesn't mean that I don't also enrich my path by incorporating or being open to ideas from other traditions as well.
Yeah, and you know, my own personal view of that is that, I mean, I think pluralism, plurality, diversity is a mystery. I don't know, or I can't just give you an easy potted discursive explanation of how all these things are going to mesh together and how all these things are going to mix together. How are we going to blend Catholicism with indigenous spirituality? How are we going to blend East and West? I'm happy in a certain way to trust the process.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not just about hermeneutics, it's also about heuristics.
Sure. Yeah, great point.
Yeah.
Well, I guess because we're coming upon or past the hour, I'd just like to say, Michelle, thanks for your time. But there was one more question, which I kind of would like to start making it a regular question here at Parmenius, which is any future works we can plug for you here, promote.
Oh, well, I am actually right now putting together in the process of organizing a second collection of poems, which I hope to have out by either the end of this year or early next year. That one is going to be titled Gem Songs.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic.
Right. Our listeners will eagerly anticipate.
Yes.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Michelle.
And we'll catch you next time.
Okay.